The ancient city of Verilius stood silent under the weight of centuries, its cobbled streets worn smooth by the endless march of time, its towering stone walls bearing the scars of forgotten wars, its people moving through the days with the quiet resignation of those who knew their lives were but fleeting whispers in the grand tapestry of history. The year was 1247, and the kingdom of Eldamir was on the brink of collapse, its once mighty rulers now reduced to squabbling over scraps of land while the common folk toiled under the oppressive yoke of taxation and conscription. In the shadow of the great cathedral, where the stained glass windows cast fractured light upon the cold stone floors, a young scribe named Alaric bent over his parchment, his quill scratching furiously as he transcribed the decrees of a king who no longer commanded respect, his fingers stained with ink, his mind heavy with the knowledge that his words would do little to alter the course of events. The air was thick with the scent of candle wax and damp parchment, the distant murmur of priests chanting their evening prayers a somber backdrop to his labor, and as he worked, he could not shake the feeling that something vast and terrible was approaching, a storm gathering on the horizon, unseen but inevitable, a force that would soon sweep away the fragile order of the world he knew. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow alleys, rattling the shutters of the cramped houses where families huddled together for warmth, their fires burning low, their bellies empty, their futures uncertain. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound sharp and lonely in the gathering dusk, and Alaric paused, his quill hovering above the page, as if he could sense the shifting tides of fate, the slow unraveling of an era that had lasted too long and yet not long enough. He was not a man of action, nor was he a hero of legends, but in that moment, he felt the weight of history pressing down upon him, the unspoken understanding that even the smallest of lives could be swept up in the currents of change, that the world was not done with him yet. The candle flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls, and with a sigh, he dipped his quill once more into the inkwell, determined to finish his work before the night deepened, before the silence of the city became unbearable, before the first whispers of rebellion reached his ears and forced him to choose a side in a conflict he had no wish to join. Chapter 2. The rebellion began not with a battle cry or a bold declaration but with a single missing shipment of grain, a minor inconvenience for the nobility but a death sentence for the villages of Blackthorn, who had already endured a harsh winter and a failed harvest, their stores nearly depleted, their children growing thin and listless, their elders succumbing to illness one by one. When the tax collectors arrived, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their hands clutching iron-bound ledgers, they showed no mercy, demanding the due even as the villagers begged for leniency, their voices cracking with desperation, their hands trembling as they offered up the last of their meager possessions. The confrontation turned violent when a young farmer, his name lost to history, struck one of the collectors in a fit of rage, his calloused hands closing around the man's throat before he was dragged away by the guards, his fate sealed before he could utter a word in his own defense. Word of the incident spread like wildfire, carried by merchants and travelers, whispered in taverns and market squares, until it reached the ears of those who had long waited for a spark to ignite the tinderbox of discontent. In the city of Valmira, a disgraced knight named Sir Edmund, once a loyal servant of the crown, now a fugitive with a price on his head, gathered a band of outcasts and idealists, their numbers small but their resolve unshakable, the goal nothing less than the overthrow of a regime they saw as corrupt beyond redemption. Meanwhile, in the royal court, King Theodoric dismissed the unrest as the grumblings of peasants, his advisers too preoccupied with their own schemes to recognize the danger, their arrogance blinding them to the truth that empires had fallen for lesser grievances. Alaric, still bent over his manuscripts in the dim light of the scriptorium, heard fragments of the growing unrest, the hushed conversations between monks, the nervous glances exchanged between guards, and though he told himself it was not his concern, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the farmer who had dared to fight back, to the knight who had chosen defiance over obedience, to the question of whether he, too, would one day be forced to take a stand. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the tension in the air thickened like a gathering storm, the kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos, its people holding their breath, waiting for the first true act of rebellion to shatter the fragile peace. Chapter 3. The first blood was spilled in the village of Hertford, where a contingent of royal soldiers, acting on orders from a paranoid magistrate, descended upon the homes of suspected dissidents, dragging men and women from their beds in the dead of night, their cries muffled by the thick fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. Among those taken was a weaver named Elspeth, a woman of no particular importance in the eyes of the crown but a pillar of her community, her hands skilled not only in the crafting of cloth but in the mending of wounds, both physical and spiritual, her absence felt immediately by those who relied on her kindness. Her husband, a quiet man named Gareth, watched helplessly as she was bound and thrown into a wagon with the others, his fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding with a rage he had never known, a rage that would not be quelled by empty promises or patient waiting. By dawn, the village was in uproar, the people gathering in the square, their fear giving way to fury, their voices rising in a chorus of demands for justice, for retribution, for something to fill the void left by the missing. It was then that Sir Edmund and his band arrived, their arrival as timely as if the gods themselves had orchestrated it, their presence lending strength to the village's resolve, their words fanning the flames of rebellion into an inferno. The magistrate, sensing the shift in the wind, fled under cover of darkness, abandoning his post like a rat deserting a sinking ship, his cowardice only fueling the people's conviction that the time for change had come. By midday, the soldiers' outpost was overrun, its gates broken down by a mob armed with little more than farming tools and righteous anger, its defenders overwhelmed not by superior force but by the sheer inevitability of the moment, the understanding that they could not hold back the tide of history. The prisoners were freed, their chains struck off, their voices joining the growing chorus of defiance, and as the sun set over Hertford, the first banner of the rebellion was raised, its sigil a broken crown encircled by a ring of wheat, a symbol of the people's strength and their refusal to be ruled by those who had forgotten the duty. News of the uprising spread faster than the royal couriers could carry their messages, reaching even the cloistered halls of the cathedral where Alaric worked, his quill pausing mid-sentence as a breathless monk recounted the events, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush, his eyes wide with disbelief and something akin to hope. For the first time in his life, Alaric set aside his work, his fingers trembling not from exhaustion but from the dawning realization that the world outside was changing, that the stories he transcribed were no longer merely records of the past but living, breathing things, and that he, too, might have a role to play in what was to come. Chapter 4. The rebellion, once a scattered murmur of discontent, now swelled into a chorus of open defiance as village after village threw off the yoke of royal authority, their people emboldened by the success at Hertford, their resolve hardened by the stories of atrocities committed by the king's men in the desperate attempts to quell the uprising. Sir Edmund, once a lone fugitive, now found himself at the head of a growing army, his name spoken with reverence by those who saw in him not just a leader but a symbol of the collective hope, his every word met with rapt attention, his every command obeyed without question. The roads between the cities became treacherous, patrolled by both royal soldiers and rebel scouts, the once bustling trade routes now littered with the remnants of abandoned carts and the occasional corpse, left to rot where it fell as a grim warning to those who dared to travel without protection. In the capital, King Theodoric finally awoke to the gravity of the situation, his council chambers filled with the panicked voices of nobles who had until now dismissed the rebellion as a minor nuisance, their complacency shattered by the realization that their own estates might soon be under threat. The king, his face lined with the weight of his crown, ordered the mobilization of the royal army, its ranks swelled by conscripts dragged from their homes, their faces sullen, their loyalty uncertain, their willingness to fight for a regime that had shown them nothing but cruelty hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, in the rebel camps, the mood was one of grim determination, the people sharing what little food they had, their spirits buoyed by the knowledge that they were fighting not just for themselves but for a future free from tyranny, their makeshift forges working day and night to turn plowshares into swords, their children acting as messengers and lookouts, their elders offering prayers to gods long neglected by the crown. Alaric, His quiet life in the scriptorium, now a distant memory, found himself drawn into the heart of the rebellion, his skill with words making him an invaluable asset to the cause, his quill now used to draft proclamations and letters of alliance rather than dry historical records, his once neat handwriting growing hurried and uneven as the pace of events outstripped his ability to document them. He had not sought this role, had never imagined himself as anything more than a chronicler of others' deeds, but history, it seemed, had other plans for him, and as he stood in the flickering light of the rebel campfires, listening to the voices of those who had risked everything for a chance at freedom, he understood that he could no longer remain a mere observer. The night was alive with the sounds of preparation, the clang of metal, the murmur of strategy, the occasional burst of laughter from those who still found joy in the midst of chaos, and above it all, the distant rumble of thunder, as if the heavens themselves were bearing witness to the turning of the tide. Chapter 5. The first major battle of the rebellion took place on the plains of Harrowfield, where the royal army, its ranks gleaming with polished armor and fluttering banners, faced the ragged but determined forces of Sir Edmund, their numbers swelled by volunteers from a dozen villages, their weapons crude but their hearts fierce. The morning dawned grey and heavy with the promise of rain, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the tension of men preparing to kill or be killed, their breaths visible in the chill as they muttered prayers or curses under their breath. The king's general, a grizzled veteran of countless campaigns, had expected an easy victory, his confidence unshaken by the reports of rebel fervor, his strategy relying on the discipline of his troops and the sheer weight of their numbers to crush the uprising before it could spread further. He had not accounted for the terrain, the way the rebels used the rolling hills and dense thickets to their advantage, nor had he anticipated the ingenuity of Sir Edmund, whose tactics were as unorthodox as they were effective. When the royal cavalry charged, their lances lowered, their horses' hooves pounding the earth like thunder, they found themselves funneled into a narrow defile where their numbers meant nothing, their formation breaking apart as the rebels rained arrows and stones down upon them from the high ground. The infantry, advancing behind them, fared no better, their lines disrupted by hidden pits and caltrops, their cohesion shattered by the sudden appearance of rebel flanking parties, their screams mingling with the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. By midday, what had begun as a confident advance had devolved into a rout, the royal forces scattering in disarray, their banners trampled into the mud, the general slain by a single well-placed arrow, his body left where it fell as his men fled for their lives. The rebels, their own losses heavy but their spirit unbroken, raised a ragged cheer as the remnants of the king's army vanished into the distance, their victory not just a tactical triumph but a symbol that the crown was not invincible, that the people could fight back and win. News of the battle spread like wildfire, carried by deserters and traveling bards, its impact rippling across the kingdom like a stone cast into a still pond, shaking the foundations of the old order and inspiring countless others to take up the cause. In the capital, King Theodric's court descended into chaos, the nobles turning on one another in a frenzy of blame and self-preservation, their once unshakable confidence replaced by a gnawing fear that their world was crumbling around them. Alaric, who had witnessed the battle from a nearby hill, his quill moving frantically across the page as he recorded the events in real time, felt something shift within him, the detached observer replaced by a man who understood that he was living through history, that his words might one day be the only testament to the sacrifices of those who had fought and died on that blood-soaked field. As the rebels celebrated their hard-won victory, their voices raised in song and their faces lit by the glow of bonfires, he allowed himself a rare moment of optimism, the first flicker of belief that perhaps, against all odds, they might actually win. Chapter 6. With the royal army in disarray, the rebellion gained momentum like a snowball rolling downhill, its ranks swelling with every passing day as peasants, craftsmen, and even disaffected minor nobles flocked to Sir Edmund's banner, their reasons as varied as their backgrounds but the goal the same, to see the old regime torn down and something new, something better, built in its place. The king, desperate to regain control, issued a series of increasingly harsh edicts, ordering the burning of rebel sympathizing villages, the execution of captured insurgents, and the conscription of every able-bodied man who could be rounded up, his decrees read aloud in town squares by grim-faced heralds who often found themselves pelted with stones or worse. The brutality only served to fuel the rebellion further, turning even those who had once been loyal to the crown into enemies, their hearts hardened by the sight of their neighbors hanged from trees or their homes reduced to smoldering ruins. In the city of Valmiera, long a hotbed of dissent, the people rose up in open revolt, storming the governor's mansion and dragging him through the streets before throwing him into the river, his body left to sink beneath the murky waters as the crowd cheered. The fall of Valmiera sent shockwaves through the kingdom, its loss not just a strategic blow but a psychological one, proof that the rebellion was no longer confined to the countryside but had reached the very heart of the realm's urban centers. Sir Edmund, now hailed as the People's General, established his headquarters in the city, his days filled with the endless work of organizing supply lines, training recruits, and negotiating with the representatives of other regions who sought to join the cause, his once simple goal of justice now complicated by the realities of governance. Alaric, who had followed the rebels to Valmiera, found himself thrust into a new role as one of the rebellion's chief scribes, his days spent drafting letters, recording decisions, and compiling reports, his small chamber in the governor's mansion lit by a single candle that burned late into the night as he worked to keep pace with the relentless march of events. He had little time to reflect on how far he had come from the quiet scriptorium where he had once spent his days transcribing dusty old texts, his life now intertwined with the fate of the rebellion in ways he could never have imagined. Outside his window, the city buzzed with activity, its streets filled with the sounds of hammering as barricades were reinforced, the murmur of voices as people debated the future, the occasional burst of laughter from those who still found moments of joy amidst the chaos. It was a strange, suspended time, the old order crumbling but the new one not yet born, the air thick with both hope and uncertainty, the sense that anything might happen next. Chapter 7. The king, his options dwindling, turned to measures increasingly desperate, summoning mercenary companies from across the sea and calling upon the loyalty of the church to declare the rebellion a heresy, its leaders excommunicated and its followers damned. The high prelate, a man whose piety was matched only by his ambition, complied without hesitation, his voice ringing out from the pulpit of the great cathedral as he condemned the rebels as agents of chaos, their souls forfeit unless they repented and returned to the fold. The decree sent a ripple of fear through the more superstitious among the populace, their faith a deep-rooted thing not easily shaken, their hearts torn between the desire for freedom and their terror of divine retribution. Sir Edmund, recognizing the danger, countered by appealing to the lower clergy, many of whom had long resented the corruption of their superiors, their sermons now emphasizing the righteousness of the people's cause and the moral duty to oppose tyranny. In the villages, where the word of the local priest carried more weight than that of distant bishops, this divide within the church proved decisive. The people's faith turned not against the rebellion but in its favor, their resolve strengthened by the belief that God was on their side. Meanwhile, the mercenaries, their loyalty bought with gold rather than conviction, proved a double-edged sword for the crown, their brutality alienating even those who might have otherwise remained neutral, their presence a constant reminder of the king's growing desperation. Alaric, tasked with drafting the rebellion's response to the excommunication, found himself wrestling with words in a way he never had before, his usual detachment giving way to a fierce determination to counter the church's narrative, to frame the rebellion not as a rejection of faith but as its purest expression. The document he produced, read aloud in town squares and nailed to church doors across the land, became a rallying cry for those who had doubted, its arguments weaving together scripture and reason in a way that even the most devout found difficult to dismiss. It was the first time his words had been given such weight, the first time he had felt the power of language not just to record history but to shape it, and the realization left him both exhilarated and unnerved. That night, as he lay awake in his narrow bed, the sounds of the city a constant hum outside his window, he dreamed not of parchment and ink but of fire and sword, of a world remade, of his own hands helping to build it. The line between scribe and rebel, between observer and participant, had blurred beyond recognition, and he was no longer certain where one ended and the other began. Chapter 8. Winter came early that year, its arrival heralded by a bitter wind that swept down from the northern mountains, coating the land in a layer of frost and turning the roads into treacherous ribbons of mud and ice. For the rebels, the season brought both challenges and opportunities, the harsh weather slowing the movements of the royal army but also straining their own supply lines, their foraging parties returning with ever-dwindling hauls as the villages they relied upon grew leaner and more desperate. In Valmira, the mood was tense but resolute, the people sharing what little they had, the communal kitchens working day and night to stretch meager rations into something resembling a meal, their children bundled in layers of patched clothing as they carried firewood and messages through the snow-covered streets. Sir Edmund, his face lined with exhaustion, spent his days in ceaseless motion, meeting with scouts, reviewing maps, and poring over reports from the front, his nights spent in fitful sleep interrupted by the constant need to make decisions that could mean life or death for thousands. Alaric, his fingers numb with cold as he worked in his makeshift office, found himself tasked with compiling a census of the rebellion's resources, food, weapons, manpower, a daunting undertaking that laid bare just how precarious their position was. The numbers were not encouraging, the reality of their situation a far cry from the heady days after Harrowfield, and as he presented his findings to the War Council, he saw the grim understanding in their eyes, the unspoken acknowledgement that the coming months would test them as never before. The king, meanwhile, had retreated to his winter palace, his court a hive of intrigue as factions jockeyed for favor, their schemes as labyrinthine as they were petty, their blindness to the suffering beyond the palace walls a testament to the gulf that now separated the rulers from the ruled. Rumors reached the rebels of dissent even among the nobility, of whispered conversations and secret pacts, of those who saw the writing on the wall and sought to position themselves for the inevitable fall of the old order. Whether any of them could be trusted was another matter entirely, and Sir Edmund, his trust a hard-won thing, made it clear that any overtures from the Crown's supporters were to be treated with the utmost caution. Alaric, his quill scratching across the page as he recorded the council's decisions, felt the weight of the moment, the understanding that they were no longer just rebels but something approaching a government, their every choice carrying consequences that would ripple far beyond the war. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in a deceptive quiet, the world holding its breath as the rebellion and the crown alike prepared for the trials to come. Chapter 9. The thaw brought not relief but renewed bloodshed, the first green shoots of spring crushed underfoot as the royal army, reinforced by fresh troops and spurred on by the king's increasingly erratic commands, launched a series of brutal campaigns aimed at crushing the rebellion once and for all. Villages suspected of harboring insurgents were put to the torch, their inhabitants slaughtered or driven into the wilderness, the land left scarred and smoking in the army's wake. The rebels, their own forces stretched thin, could do little to protect every settlement, their strategy shifting to one of selective engagement, striking where the enemy was weakest and fading away before reinforcements could arrive. It was a war of shadows and whispers, of ambushes and midnight raids, the lines between soldier and civilian blurring until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Sir Edmund, his beard now streaked with grey, moved his forces like pieces on a chessboard, his tactics growing ever more unorthodox as the stakes rose, his name whispered with equal parts awe and fear by friend and foe alike. In Valmira, the mood was grim but determined, the people hardening themselves against the reports of atrocities filtering in from the countryside, their resolve unshaken even as the cost of victory grew clearer with each passing day. Alaric, his once neat records now a chaotic jumble of casualty lists and supply requisitions, found himself drafted into the grim task of documenting the enemy's crimes, his words stripped of the usual eloquence as he struggled to convey the sheer scale of the suffering. The pages he filled were a testament to horrors he could scarcely comprehend, let alone describe, and more than once he had to set aside his quill, his hands shaking too badly to continue. It was after one such moment, his vision blurred by exhaustion and unshed tears, that he was approached by a figure he had not seen in months, Brother Kilian, the monk who had once been his mentor in the scriptorium, his robes travel-stained and his face gaunt with hunger. The old man had come not to chide or to preach but to offer his help, his quiet strength a balm to Alaric's frayed nerves, his presence a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there were still those who held fast to their humanity. Together, they worked through the night, their voices low as they pieced together the fragments of stories that would otherwise have been lost, their labor not just a record of pain but a promise that it would not be forgotten. By dawn, the weight in Alaric's chest had eased slightly, the burden shared if not lessened, and as the first light of day filtered through the narrow window, he allowed himself a moment of quiet gratitude for the small mercies that still remained. Chapter 10. The tide of the war turned, as tides often do, not with a single cataclysmic event but with 1,000 small shifts, each insignificant on its own but together forming a current too strong to resist. The king's mercenaries, their pay increasingly delayed, began to desert in droves, their loyalty evaporating along with the gold, the departure leaving gaping holes in the royal defenses. The nobility, their estates ravaged by the fighting and their influence waning, grew ever more vocal in the demands for a negotiated peace, their self-interest aligning, for once, with the needs of the realm. Even the church, its authority undermined by the rebellion's counter-narrative, began to fracture, its lower ranks increasingly defiant, its unity shattered beyond repair. Sir Edmund, sensing the moment was ripe, launched a daring offensive aimed not at the king's armies but at the very heart of his power, the capital itself. The march was grueling, the rebels forced to navigate treacherous terrain and evade enemy patrols, their progress slowed by spring rains that turned the roads into rivers of mud. Yet with each mile they covered, their numbers grew, their ranks swelled by those who saw in their advance the promise of an ending, one way or another. Alaric, his place now firmly among the rebellion's inner circle, rode with them, his satchel filled not just with documents but with letters from villages and towns along the way, each one a plea for deliverance, a testament to the hope they had inspired. The capital, when it finally came into view, was a sight to behold, its towering walls and glittering spires a stark contrast to the ruined countryside, its gates barred against the approaching storm. The king, his once proud bearing now hunched with paranoia and drink, appeared on the battlements to hurl curses at the rebels, his voice cracking with rage, his words a futile attempt to command a loyalty he had long since squandered. Sir Edmund, his armor dented and his banner frayed but his resolve unbroken, gave the order to prepare for siege, his words met with a roar of approval from the men and women who had followed him this far. As the rebels dug in, their camp a bustling hive of activity, Alaric found a quiet moment to himself, his eyes tracing the outline of the city that had once been the unassailable symbol of the old order, now just another fortress waiting to fall. The end, whatever it might bring, was near, and as he set quill to parchment once more, he wondered if his words would be the last to record the reign of a king, or the first to herald the birth of something new. Chapter 11. The siege of the capital began not with the thunderous crash of battering rams but with the quiet, methodical strangulation of supply lines, the rebel forces encircling the city like a noose tightening around a neck, their scouts intercepting merchant caravans and burning outlying storehouses to deny the defenders even a crust of bread. Within the walls, the mood shifted rapidly from defiance to desperation as the markets emptied and the price of a loaf of bread soared to heights only the nobility could afford, the common folk forced to queue for hours outside the royal granaries only to be turned away with empty hands and hollow stomachs. King Theodoric, his once regal bearing now diminished by sleepless nights and the tremors of too much wine, vacillated between fury and despair, his counselors offering contradictory advice that only deepened the chaos, their whispered arguments echoing through the marble halls of the palace like the scuttling of rats in the walls. The city guard, their loyalty strained by months of unpaid wages and the sight of their own families starving, began to look the other way as desperate citizens scaled the walls at night in search of food or escape, the discipline crumbling as surely as the mortar between the stones. Outside, Sir Edmund maintained relentless pressure, his engineers constructing trebuchets that lobbed not just stones but barrels of pamphlets over the walls, their messages promising mercy to those who surrendered and justice for those who had oppressed them, the words seeping into the collective consciousness of the city like rainwater into parched earth. Alaric, now entrusted with drafting these missives, found himself haunted by the knowledge that each phrase he penned might mean the difference between life and death for thousands, his quill scratching out appeals to reason and decency even as the rebel war council debated harsher measures. The nights were the worst, the air thick with the distant cries of those trapped inside the walls, the glow of their cooking fires growing fewer with each passing evening, the stench of desperation carrying on the wind. On the third week of the siege, a delegation of city elders managed to slip through the gates under cover of darkness, their faces gaunt, their hands trembling as they begged for terms, their presence proof that even the staunchest loyalists could no longer deny the inevitable. Sir Edmund received them not in his tent but in the open air, before the assembled ranks of his army, a calculated display of transparency that underscored the rebellion's rejection of the old ways of backroom deals and hidden agendas. The terms he offered were stern but not cruel, the king to be deposed but not executed, his supporters to face trial but not summary vengeance, the people to be fed immediately and without condition. As the elders knelt in the mud to kiss his hand, the first real snow of winter began to fall, the flakes settling on their bowed heads like a benediction, the silence of the moment broken only by the distant tolling of the capital's great bell, its mournful peal a dirge for a dying regime. Chapter 12. The surrender, when it came, was as anticlimactic as it was inevitable, the great gates creaking open at dawn, the city guard laying down their arms in sullen silence, the once proud banners of the royal house lowered into the dirt to be trampled underfoot. King Theodoric was found not on his throne but in his private chapel, his hands clutching a goblet of wine gone sour, his eyes vacant as he muttered half-remembered prayers to gods who had clearly abandoned him. The rebels, their entry into the city carefully orchestrated to prevent looting or reprisals, moved with a discipline that surprised even their own commanders, their ranks holding firm against the tidal wave of desperate citizens who surged forward begging for bread before the last of the royal garrison had even been disarmed. Sir Edmund, his armor polished for the occasion but his face still grim with the weight of responsibility, rode straight to the palace steps where he dismounted and knelt, not in submission, but to lift a starving child from the gutter, pressing a loaf of bread into its hands before the assembled crowd, a gesture so simple and human that it did more to cement his authority than any coronation could have. Alaric, trailing in his wake with a satchel full of proclamations, watched as the reality of victory settled over the ranks, the dazed expressions of men and women who had never truly believed they would live to see this day, the joy tempered by the sheer scale of the devastation around them. The palace treasury, when opened, revealed not the mountains of gold the rebels had expected but a handful of tarnished coins and promissory notes, the kingdom's wealth squandered on mercenaries and feasts while the roads crumbled and the people starved. In the days that followed, the mechanisms of governance ground into motion with painful slowness, the rebellion's idealists colliding with the pragmatists over every decision, how harshly to punish the king's supporters, how to redistribute land, whether to abolish the nobility entirely or merely strip them of their privileges. Alaric, thrust into the role of archivist for this new order, found himself transcribing debates that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, his pages filling with talk of elected councils and communal granaries, of rights and responsibilities, the very language of power shifting under his pen. At night, when the candles burned low and the others had retired, he allowed himself to read over his own earlier chronicles, the record of a world that already seemed as distant as the legends of old, the ink on those pages barely dry yet speaking of a time as dead as the kings buried beneath the cathedral floor. Chapter 13. The trial of King Theodoric was an affair as meticulously stage-managed as it was unprecedented, held not in some shadowed chamber but in the great square before the cathedral, the accused seated not on a throne but on a plain wooden stool, his purple robes replaced by the rough-spun tunic of a prisoner. The charges, read aloud by a herald whose voice carried over the hushed crowd, spanned decades of misrule, the unjust taxes, the vanished soldiers, the villagers left to starve, each accusation met with a murmur of recognition from the assembled citizens, the collective memory long but their vengeance until now impotent. The king, his once commanding presence reduced to a shrunken silhouette, listened with a face like stone, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, as if already seeing his place in the histories that would condemn him. Sir Edmund, presiding not as judge but as first among equals, allowed the proceedings to unfold with a solemnity that bordered on reverence, his interventions few but pointed, his questions cutting through the legal niceties to lay bare the human cost of each royal decree. Alaric, seated at a scribe's table near the front, recorded every word in a hand that grew progressively shakier as the days wore on, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force, the realization that he was documenting the death throes of an era making each stroke of his quill feel like carving words into stone. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, but with the sentence commuted from execution to permanent exile, the crowd erupted in a roar that was neither wholly approving nor wholly angry, a sound as complex and contradictory as the revolution itself. The king, aloud a final statement, rose with a dignity that had eluded him for months and spoke not in his own defense but to acknowledge the legitimacy of the court that had condemned him, his words less an apology than a capitulation to the inevitable, his surrender of authority as complete as it was irreversible. That night, as the city celebrated with bonfires and stolen wine, Alaric walked the empty halls of the palace, his footsteps echoing through chambers that still smelled of perfume and decay, his fingers trailing over tapestries that depicted battles no one would remember anymore. In the scriptorium, where royal decrees had once been copied by the light of 100 candles, he found a single sheet of parchment left behind in the rush to flee, its surface bearing only half of a sentence, the ink smeared where the scribe's hand had faltered. He never learned what that sentence was meant to say, but he kept the fragment anyway, folding it carefully into his journal as a reminder that history was not just the grand narratives but the unfinished thoughts, the interrupted lives, the words left unsaid. Chapter 14. Rebuilding proved infinitely harder than tearing down. With the king's ship barely vanished over the horizon, the rebel council found itself grappling not with the abstract ideals of justice but with the daily, grinding work of governance, the clogged sewers backing up into the streets, the disputes over who now owned a particular plot of land, the outbreaks of fever in the overcrowded tenements where the poorest had been left to fend for themselves. Sir Edmund, hailed as a liberator, but increasingly uncomfortable with the trappings of power, divided his time between the battlefield, where royalist holdouts still smoldered in the provinces, and the council chamber, where the debates over the new constitution grew so heated that more than one session ended with overturned tables and bloody noses. The document itself, drafted by a committee of scholars and cobblers and former monks, was a strange and wondrous thing, its preamble declaring not the divine right of rulers but the inherent sovereignty of the people, its articles outlining protections for everything from farmland to free speech, its very existence a challenge to every throne on the continent. Alaric, tasked with producing clean copies for distribution to every town and village, worked until his fingers cramped and his vision blurred, his usual detachment giving way to a creeping sense of awe at what they were attempting. Outside the palace walls, the city was a cacophony of experimentation, workers' cooperatives taking over abandoned noble estates, street corner philosophers holding forth on the nature of democracy, children playing games where they pretended to elect their own leaders. Not all of it was hopeful. The first executions of royalist conspirators drew crowds that were a little too eager, the guillotine's blade falling with a sound that haunted Alaric's dreams. And always, lurking at the edges of every conversation, was the question no one could answer: what happened when the unity born of shared struggle met the mundane reality of disagreement? When the people who had fought side by side against tyranny found themselves at odds over what came next. The first cracks appeared during the debate over the church's lands, with some arguing for outright seizure and redistribution, others for a gradual buyout, still others for leaving the whole question to some future generation. Sir Edmund, his patience fraying, finally silenced the chamber with a single slammed fist and a reminder that they were building a nation, not a debating society, his words a warning that ideals alone could not feed the hungry or keep the peace. That night, Alaric added a private note to his official record, a quote from an ancient philosopher he'd once copied in the scriptorium, about how the measure of a society was not how it behaved in revolution but how it endured in the aftermath. He wasn't sure if he believed it yet, but he wanted to. Chapter 15. The first elections were a chaotic, glorious mess, the voting rolls hastily compiled from tax records and militia lists, the polling stations set up in everything from taverns to temple courtyards, the ballots counted by squinting elders under the light of oil lamps. There were irregularities, of course, a village where someone stuffed the box with votes for his prize pig, a district where no women were allowed to participate despite the new laws, a handful of isolated incidents where royalist sympathizers tried to disrupt the process with threats or worse. But when the results were finally tallied and the new assembly convened, the sheer diversity of the gathered representatives took even the most optimistic observers by surprise. Farmers in homespun sitting beside merchants in fine wool, former soldiers with missing limbs debating alongside scholars who had spent their lives buried in books, their voices rough or refined but all equally valid in the eyes of the law. Sir Edmund, elected to lead the body by acclamation, opened the first session not with a speech but with a moment of silence for those who had not lived to see this day, the weight of that absence settling over the chamber like a shroud. Alaric, granted a permanent seat at the scribe's table, found himself transfixed by the way these unlikely lawmakers stumbled toward consensus, their debates meandering but earnest, their mistakes corrected not by fiat but by persuasion, the whole messy experiment somehow holding together through sheer force of collective will. Outside, the seasons turned, the first harvest under the new order brought in with communal celebrations that felt almost like religious observances, the granaries filling not for the benefit of distant lords but for the people themselves. In the countryside, the last royalist strongholds fell one by one, the garrison surrendering not to armies but to pamphlets read aloud by their own soldiers, the power of an idea proving stronger than any fortress. And in a small, unremarkable room in the palace, now repurposed as an archive, Alaric began the task of organizing the mountains of paperwork generated by this new way of governing, his once neat categories constantly disrupted by the sheer novelty of what they were creating. One evening, as he labeled a box of petitions from citizens who had once been considered too insignificant to even address their rulers by name, it occurred to him that he was no longer just recording history, he was helping to shape it, one carefully preserved document at a time. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, for the first time in his life, he felt something like peace. Chapter 16. Winter returned, but this time the city was ready, its storehouses stocked through the collective labor of its citizens, its streets patrolled not by enforcers but by volunteers who saw the duty as a privilege rather than a burden. The assembly, having survived its first tumultuous months, turned its attention to longer-term projects, a system of schools, a network of roads, the codification of laws that had until now existed only as oral traditions or the arbitrary whims of local magistrates. Sir Edmund, his hair graying at the temples but his energy undiminished, spent less time in the chamber and more in the field, traveling from town to listen to grievances and explain the new order, his presence a living reminder that the government existed to serve rather than to rule. Alaric, now chief archivist in addition to his scribal duties, found himself inundated with requests from every corner of the realm, for copies of the Constitution, for records of past decisions, for guidance on how to conduct their own local elections. The sheer volume of work should have been crushing, but there was a vitality to it that kept him going, the knowledge that each document he preserved would help this fragile experiment endure. Not all was harmonious, of course, the northern provinces grumbled about southern dominance, the guilds jockeyed for advantage in the new economy, and in the taverns, the debates over how much power the central government should wield grew increasingly heated. But when a group of disgruntled former nobles attempted to rally support for a return to the old ways, they found themselves shouted down not by soldiers but by their own neighbors, the very people they had once dismissed as too ignorant to know what was best for them. The incident, minor in itself, became a turning point in the collective psyche, proof that the revolution had taken root in ways that went deeper than laws or institutions. On the anniversary of the king's surrender, the city held a festival unlike anything in its history. No military parades, no forced displays of loyalty, just a spontaneous outpouring of music and storytelling and shared meals, the celebrations continuing long into the night. Alaric, wandering through the crowds with a cup of surprisingly good local wine, found himself stopped every few paces by citizens wanting to shake his hand or clap him on the back, the gratitude for his chronicles. Both touching and vaguely embarrassing. Near midnight, he spotted Sir Edmund standing alone on a bridge, watching the lanterns reflected in the river below, his expression unreadable. When Alaric joined him, the older man spoke not of triumphs or challenges but of his childhood in a village much like those they had liberated, of the way the smoke from the hearth fires used to hang over the fields at dusk, of the simple, unremarkable beauty of a world where no one had to bow. They stood there in companionable silence for a long time, two men who had never set out to change history but had done so anyway, the weight of what they had built settling over them like the first snow of winter, gentle, inexorable, and infinitely fragile. Chapter 17. The first real crisis came with the spring floods, the river bursting its banks to submerge entire neighborhoods, the hastily rebuilt levees proving no match for the meltwater from the northern mountains. As the waters rose, so too did the old instincts, the wealthier citizens hoarding supplies, the rumors of looting spreading faster than the flood itself, the inevitable calls for someone to take charge and restore order. The assembly, caught off guard by the scale of the disaster, convened an emergency session that quickly devolved into shouting matches between those who favored centralized relief efforts and those who insisted local councils could handle the situation alone. Sir Edmund, summoned back from the provinces, arrived to find the chamber in chaos, his usual patience worn thin by days of hard travel. What happened next would be debated for years. Some claimed he lost his temper, others that he had planned it all along, but when he climbed onto the speaker's dais and began stripping off his official robes, the room fell so silent you could hear the fabric hit the floor. Dressed now in the plain tunic and boots of a common laborer, he announced his intention to go down to the flooded districts and start bailing water, inviting anyone who actually gave a damn about the people they were supposed to serve to join him. The effect was electric, the stunned assembly members rising as one to follow him into the streets, their fine shoes sinking into the mud as they worked side by side with carpenters and washerwomen to build makeshift barriers and distribute supplies. Alaric, trailing behind with his ever-present notebook, documented not just the physical labor but the way the crisis dissolved, at least temporarily, the artificial barriers between rulers and ruled, the shared struggle creating a solidarity that no decree could have mandated. By week's end, the waters had receded, leaving behind a city battered but unbowed, its people already clearing the debris and arguing good-naturedly about how to rebuild better this time. In the assembly's next session, the tone was markedly different, the petty squabbles set aside in favor of practical solutions, the recognition dawning that governance was not about power but about service, not about commanding but about cooperating. Sir Edmund, back in his official robes but with his sleeves still rolled up from the cleanup, listened more than he spoke, his occasional interventions steering the debate toward consensus rather than dictating it. Afterward, over a private meal in the palace kitchens, neither man had much taste for formal dining anymore. He confessed to Alaric that he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up, the weight of expectation bearing down on him in ways no battlefield ever had. Alaric, who had seen the way the other man's hands shook when he thought no one was looking, offered no empty reassurances, just the simple observation that no one had ever done what they were trying to do, that it was all right to be tired, and that the work would continue with or without them. The look of gratitude he received in return was worth more than any official commendation. Chapter 18. The news from across the border arrived with the summer caravans. The neighboring kingdoms, initially dismissive of the rebellion, had grown increasingly alarmed as its ideas took root, their own peasants beginning to ask uncomfortable questions, their minor nobles showing a troubling interest in reform. The response had been predictably brutal, a wave of repression that sent refugees streaming across the border, their tales of hangings and burned villages stirring outrage in the assembly. The debate over whether to intervene raged for weeks, the idealists arguing for exporting their revolution, the pragmatists warning of overextension, the hawks pointing out that a preemptive strike might be their only chance against monarchs who would never tolerate a free society on the doorstep. Sir Edmund, who had seen enough of war to last a lifetime, surprised everyone by siding with the interventionists, not for glory or conquest, he stressed, but to offer the same chance they had been given to people who had done nothing to deserve the chains. The vote, when it came, was closer than any in the Assembly's short history, the measure passing by a handful of voices, the division lines cutting across every faction and region. Alaric, transcribing the roll call, felt the gravity of the moment in his very bones, the understanding that they were crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. The mobilization that followed was unlike anything in living memory, not the forced conscriptions of the old regime but a citizen army volunteering en masse, their training accelerated but no less rigorous for it, their morale bolstered by the knowledge that they fought not for a king's vanity but for their own survival. The first engagements were less battles than armed demonstrations, rebel columns crossing the border not to pillage but to distribute food and pamphlets, their ranks swelling with defectors as they went. The opposing monarchs, expecting a rabble, found themselves facing disciplined units that fought with the desperation of those who knew what they stood to lose, their outdated tactics no match for the flexibility of an army that trusted its commanders enough to think for itself. Alaric, deemed too valuable to risk on the front lines, remained behind to coordinate the flow of information, his archives now a nerve center where reports from the front were cross-referenced with maps and supply lists, the mundane work of logistics proving as crucial as any heroics on the battlefield. At night, when the candles burned low and the couriers had all departed, he allowed himself to imagine how future historians might record these days, not as the end of something, he hoped, but as the painful, messy birth of a world where no man had to kneel. Chapter 19. Victory, when it came, was not the triumphant march they had envisioned but a slow unraveling, the enemy's will to fight eroding under the relentless pressure of a people who had tasted freedom and refused to forget it. One by one, the neighboring kingdoms toppled, not to foreign invasion but to their own citizens, the spark of rebellion jumping borders with a speed that terrified the remaining monarchs of the continent. The Assembly, now governing a territory 3 times its original size, struggled to adapt, its carefully balanced systems strained by the sheer diversity of new voices demanding to be heard. Sir Edmund, who had aged a decade in as many months, spent his days mediating disputes between regions with centuries of enmity between them, his nights drafting proposals for a loose federation that could accommodate local autonomy while maintaining essential unity. The compromises were rarely satisfying to anyone, the process exhausting and incremental, but somehow, against all odds, it held together, not through force, but through the shared understanding that the alternative was unthinkable. Alaric, overseeing a team of scribes tasked with translating the new agreements into a dozen languages and dialects, marveled at how easily the old borders had dissolved once people stopped believing in them, how quickly former enemies could find common cause when given the space to do so. On the day the last holdout city surrendered, not to armies but to its own women, who had barricaded the gates against their lords until they agreed to negotiate, the Assembly declared a week of celebration, the festivities deliberately modeled on the local customs of each region, a mosaic of traditions that somehow formed a coherent whole. Sir Edmund, addressing the gathered representatives, spoke not of conquest but of continuity, not of endings but of beginnings, his voice hoarse but steady as he reminded them that the work would never truly be done, that freedom was not a state but a practice, not a gift but a responsibility. Afterward, as the feasting and dancing spilled out into the streets, he slipped away unnoticed, his footsteps leading not to the palace but to the small house by the river where he had lived before the revolution, its door still unlocked, its few rooms unchanged save for the layer of dust that had settled over everything. Alaric, finding him there hours later, said nothing, simply took a seat by the fire and accepted the cup of terrible homebrewed ale he was offered, the two men sitting in silence as the sounds of the celebration drifted in through the open window. There would be time enough tomorrow for debates and documents, for the endless work of building a world worthy of the sacrifices that had been made. Tonight, for the first time in longer than either could remember, they allowed themselves to simply be. Chapter 20. The years that followed were neither as dramatic nor as easily summarized as the revolution itself, the great questions of liberty and justice giving way to the thousand small compromises of everyday governance, the allocation of bridge repairs, the standardization of weights and measures, the interminable debates over whether the new university should prioritize practical skills or philosophical inquiry. Sir Edmund, having declined any official title, continued to serve as the Assembly's guiding voice, his influence waning as the system grew less dependent on any one person, his occasional interventions all the more powerful for their rarity. The Federation, though far from perfect, proved resilient enough to weather its first major crisis when a poor harvest threatened famine across 3 provinces, the mechanisms of mutual aid kicking in with minimal fuss, the old spectre of hoarding and panic conspicuously absent. Alaric, now grey at the temples but no less dedicated to his work, oversaw the creation of regional archives where every citizen could access the laws that governed them, his once lonely obsession with preservation having become a cornerstone of the new order. Children who had been born after the revolution took their rights for granted, their parents' stories of the old days seeming as distant and improbable as fairy tales, their world one where elections and accountability were as natural as the changing of the seasons. When Sir Edmund passed, quietly, in his sleep, with no fanfare or farewell speeches, the entire Federation mourned, not with the performative grief demanded by kings but with a genuine, collective sense of loss that transcended region or faction. His funeral procession stretched for miles, not because anyone had ordered it but because people kept joining as it passed through their towns, each adding their own small tribute, a flower, a song, a handful of soil from a field he had helped liberate. Alaric, asked to deliver the official eulogy, found himself unable to speak for several minutes, the weight of all they had lived through catching up with him at last. When he finally found his voice, it was not to recite a list of accomplishments but to tell a simple story about a man who had never stopped believing that people were capable of more than their rulers thought possible, and who had been proven right against all odds. In the archives, tucked between the dry records of assembly votes and trade agreements, there is an unassuming box labeled simply, "The Beginning." Inside, carefully preserved despite their humble origins, are the first ragged pamphlets of the rebellion, the hastily scribbled notes from underground meetings, the smudged and water-stained pages that documented how a handful of ordinary people changed the world. Few visitors request to see them anymore, their contents long since superseded by the polished histories and official chronicles. But sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the light slants just through the high windows, the old archivist can be found there, running his fingers over the words he once wrote in fear and hope, remembering. Chapter 21. The first generation to grow up entirely under the new order came of age in a world the grandparents would not have recognized, where the idea of kingship was a curious relic discussed in history lessons, where the right to question one's leaders was as fundamental as the right to eat or breathe. The academies established in the early years of the Federation now produced not clerks and functionaries but engineers, physicians, and philosophers whose work began to ripple outward, transforming agriculture with systematic crop rotations, medicine with empirical studies of disease, and even the arts with bold new forms that celebrated the common human experience rather than the exploits of elites. Yet progress was neither seamless nor universal. The northern provinces, with their long tradition of communal land management, clashed with the southern merchants who saw untapped profit in privatizing fields and forests, while the eastern territories, with the complex tapestry of ethnicities and faiths, chafed under what they perceived as the homogenizing pressure of federal laws. The Assembly, once a revolutionary council operating on instinct and idealism, had matured into a sprawling bureaucratic apparatus, its procedures increasingly codified, its debates increasingly mired in procedural minutiae. Alaric, now the white-haired keeper of the central archives, watched these growing pains with a mixture of pride and concern, recognizing in the petty squabbles over taxation and infrastructure the same existential stakes that had once been fought with swords and pamphlets. His greatest project, a comprehensive history of the revolution based on primary sources rather than myth, had become a quiet obsession, his draft scrutinized not by senses but by his own relentless pursuit of truth, his determination to ensure that future generations understood their inheritance not as inevitable but as something fragile and hard-won. When a delegation of students from the newly founded University of Harrowfield petitioned to interview him for their oral history initiative, he agreed with uncharacteristic sentimentality, spending long afternoons recounting not just the grand events but the small, human moments that had shaped them, the taste of stolen bread during the siege, the sound of Sir Edmund's laughter after a particularly absurd debate, the way the first snow of that pivotal winter had muffled all sound, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Chapter 22. The crisis no one had anticipated came not from external threats or internal dissent but from the very success of the Federation's ideals. As literacy spread and printing technology advanced, the once unified revolutionary consensus fractured into a cacophony of competing movements, utopian communalists demanding the abolition of private property, merchant leagues pushing for deregulation, religious revivalists warning of moral decay, and a dozen other factions each convinced their vision represented the true legacy of the revolution. The assembly, designed for deliberation rather than speed, found itself paralyzed as every proposal, no matter how minor, became a proxy battle for the soul of the Federation. In the streets, what had once been vigorous debate began to curdle into something darker, with rival pamphleteers denouncing each other as traitors to the cause and occasional scuffles breaking out at public forums. The breaking point came when a radical faction in the western provinces unilaterally declared their right to secede, their manifesto quoting liberally from the Federation's own founding documents to justify their rebellion against the rebellion. The aging veterans of the original uprising watched in horror as their worst fears materialized, not the return of monarchy, but the unraveling of everything they had built through sheer force of idealism and will. Alaric, summoned to an emergency session of the Assembly, listened as speaker after speaker rose to propose solutions ranging from military suppression to total acquiescence, his heart sinking with each extreme. It was a young delegate from the Eastern Highlands, a woman whose parents had been children during the Revolution, who finally cut through the noise with a simple question: what would Sir Edmund have done? The silence that followed was not the silence of certainty, but of collective introspection, the realization dawning that the answer lay not in replicating the past but in applying its principles to new challenges. The compromise that emerged, a constitutional convention to renegotiate the balance between local autonomy and federal unity, was messy, imperfect, and quintessentially human, exactly the kind of solution their old leader would have championed. Chapter 23. The Constitutional Convention of Year 37 was, by design, the antithesis of the Revolution's early days, not a secret gathering of desperate plotters, but a meticulously planned, painstakingly inclusive process that stretched across 18 months and every corner of the Federation. Citizens' assemblies met in town halls and market squares to draft proposals, their recommendations funneled upward through regional councils before reaching the Central Drafting Committee, where teams of jurists and philosophers struggled to synthesize thousands of sometimes contradictory demands into a coherent framework. Alaric, though officially retired, was coaxed into serving as the convention's chief archivist, his encyclopedic knowledge of the original documents proving invaluable as delegates debated whether proposed changes honored or betrayed the revolution's spirit. The most heated arguments centered on the limits of majority rule, how to protect minority rights without creating privileged classes, how to balance free expression with the need for social cohesion, whether economic inequality in a free society represented a failure or an inevitability. What emerged was neither the radical overhaul some had hoped for nor the reactionary reversal others feared, but something more durable precisely because of its flexibility, a framework that embedded mechanisms for periodic review and amendment, that recognized rights not as static entitlements but as evolving concepts requiring constant vigilance. The ratification process itself became a festival of civic engagement, with public readings in every village, illustrated primers for those still struggling with literacy, and even traveling troupes of actors performing simplified versions of the debates for audiences who found legal language impenetrable. When the final vote came, the margin was decisive but not unanimous, a healthy reminder, many observed, that dissent itself was a right worth preserving. On the day the new constitution took effect, the Federation celebrated not with military parades but with a coordinated planting of liberty trees, a tradition borrowed from the earliest days of the uprising, each sapling accompanied by a time capsule containing local artifacts and letters to the future. Alaric, standing beside the sapling planted outside the central archives, allowed himself a rare moment of public emotion as he placed his original, ink-stained notes from the siege of the capital into the capsule, his hands trembling only slightly as he sealed the container. Later, watching the sunset from his favorite bench in the archives courtyard, he realized with quiet astonishment that he had lived long enough to see the revolution become history rather than memory, its actors transformed from comrades into subjects of study, their choices analyzed rather than simply lived. The thought should have made him feel obsolete. Instead, it filled him with a profound sense of continuity, the understanding that every generation must rediscover freedom for itself, and that his life's work would be there to guide them when they did. Chapter 24. The world beyond the Federation's borders, initially dismissive of what monarchs had derided as the peasant experiment, could no longer ignore the undeniable evidence of its success, not just in stability and prosperity, but in the sheer vitality of its culture, the innovations flowing from its universities and workshops, the magnetic appeal of its foundational ideals. Diplomatic overtures arrived from states that had once vowed to crush the rebellion, their envoys bearing gifts and trade proposals alongside discreet requests for advice on administrative reforms. The Assembly, after heated debate, agreed to establish diplomatic relations but drew a firm line at military alliances, refusing to prop up regimes that denied their own people basic rights. This principled stance was put to the test when a wave of uprisings swept the southern continent, their leaders explicitly modeling their struggles on the Federation's example, the desperate pleas for aid arriving daily via merchant ships and clandestine couriers. The debate that followed split the Assembly down the middle, the interventionists arguing that they had a moral duty to assist, the isolationists warning of overreach and unintended consequences, the pragmatists seeking some middle path of non-military support. Alaric, though no longer a voting member, was called upon to settle a procedural dispute regarding the original constitution's intent, his ruling, that the Federation could offer refuge and intellectual solidarity but not impose its will by force, carrying unexpected weight precisely because of his reputation for impartiality. The compromise solution, a network of clandestine schools along the border where exiles could train as teachers and organizers before returning home, became one of the Federation's most enduring legacies, its impact rippling across generations in ways no battlefield victory could have achieved. At home, the influx of refugees and ideas further enriched the already vibrant cultural tapestry, their languages and traditions, blending with local customs to create something entirely new. Walking through the capital's bustling international district, where the smell of strange spices mingled with the sound of a dozen dialects, Alaric marveled at how thoroughly the world had changed, and how much work remained. His latest project, a multilingual glossary of political terms designed to bridge conceptual gaps between cultures, was proving both frustrating and exhilarating, the very act of translation forcing him to re-examine assumptions he hadn't realized he'd held. On the eve of his 80th birthday, as he prepared to hand the archives over to a new generation of scholars, he allowed himself one small vanity, a single shelf in the reference section reserved for his personal journals, their pages a testament to the ordinary human labor that underlay even the grandest historical transformations. The inscription he penned for the shelf's dedication plaque was characteristically succinct, "For those who will continue the work." Chapter 25. The end, when it came, was as quiet as the man himself. A cold morning found by the caretaker, Alaric seated at his favorite reading desk with a half-finished page before him, his face peaceful, his pen still resting between ink-stained fingers. The news spread through the city not as a shock but as a gentle tide of recognition, the passing of the last living link to the revolution's earliest days prompting not mourning so much as reflection. The state funeral, held in the People's Hall where the first assembly had convened, was attended not just by officials but by hundreds of ordinary citizens, archivists and farmers, teachers and laborers, their lives touched in ways large and small by the systems he had helped build and preserve. The eulogy, delivered by a young historian who had once been his student, focused not on battles or decrees but on Alaric's quiet insistence that every life mattered to the historical record, that the unnamed and the unremembered were as much a part of the story as the generals and orators. In the weeks that followed, a curious phenomenon occurred. People from all walks of life began bringing their personal records to the archives, not just official documents but diaries, letters, even grocery lists and children's drawings, all accompanied by the same simple request: add this to the collection. The new head archivist, initially overwhelmed by the deluge, soon realized this was not mere sentimentality but a profound act of collective ownership, the people asserting their right to define their own history. Years later, when scholars would debate the precise moment the Federation transitioned from a revolutionary experiment to an enduring civilization, many would point to this spontaneous outpouring as the true test passed, not the dramatic confrontations of the early years, but the quiet understanding that preserving the past was everyone's responsibility, that freedom was not just seized but maintained, one ordinary act of remembrance at a time. And in the central reading room of the archives, beneath a skylight that bathed the long tables in sunlight, a single shelf remained perpetually stocked with fresh flowers, their origins and bearers unknown, their presence a wordless promise that the work would indeed continue. Chapter 26. The archives, once a quiet repository of documents, had become a living institution, a place where citizens came not only to research but to debate, teach, and even perform plays based on the revolution's history. The new head archivist, a sharp-eyed woman named Leora who had trained under Alaric, implemented his unfinished plan to create a public storytelling hall adjacent to the reading rooms, where elders could recount their memories and children could listen wide-eyed to tales of a time when the world had been remade. Yet not all was serene in this new era. The very accessibility of history meant that interpretations of the past became contested ground. A fierce debate erupted when a radical faction published the true history of the revolution *, a polemic that accused the early leaders of compromising too quickly with the old nobility, their arguments cherry-picking from archival records to paint Sir Edmund as a reluctant reformer rather than the visionary he was remembered as. Leora, facing pressure from the assembly to censure the work, instead did something unprecedented. She organized a public symposium where critics and defenders of the book could debate using primary sources displayed in glass cases between them, the documents themselves serving as both evidence and mediator. The event, which lasted 3 full days and drew crowds from across the Federation, ended not with consensus but with something more valuable, a shared understanding that history was not scripture, that reverence for the past should not preclude questioning it. Afterwards, visitors noticed a new plaque installed beside the archive's entrance, its words adapted from one of Alaric's last journal entries: "A nation that canonizes its revolution ceases to be revolutionary." Chapter 27. The question of how to mark the revolution's 50th anniversary divided the Federation more deeply than any foreign threat ever had. Traditionalists wanted a grand military parade showcasing the People's Army veterans. Modernists proposed an international festival of arts and sciences. Radicals demanded a year of redistributive reforms to honor the uprising's egalitarian roots. The solution emerged from an unexpected quarter. The children's councils that had been established in schools across the nation proposed turning the anniversary into a year of doing, where every citizen would undertake a project to improve their community, no matter how small. The idea caught fire, transforming what could have been empty ceremony into a nationwide surge of civic energy. Farmers organized seed-sharing networks, dockworkers rebuilt crumbling piers in their free hours, and in the capital, a team of engineers and street sweepers collaborated to solve the chronic flooding in the old merchants' quarter, a problem the nobility had ignored for centuries. Leora, watching from the archive steps as volunteers repaved the square with stones salvaged from a demolished prison, realized this was history unfolding in its purest form, not as pageantry, but as lived practice. Her team worked tirelessly to document the spontaneous projects, their reports eschewing dry statistics in favor of handwritten notes from participants. One entry, from a 10-year-old who had organized her classmates to repair a widow's roof, seemed to capture the spirit of the year. "We didn't ask permission. We just did it, like they did." Chapter 28. The completion of the Great Northern Canal, a decades-old dream to connect the Federation's heartland to the sea, should have been a unifying triumph. Instead, it nearly sparked civil war. The engineers' plan required flooding a valley sacred to the hillfolk, a minority group who had reluctantly joined the Federation years earlier. When the Assembly voted to proceed anyway, citing the greater good for the majority, armed resistance erupted overnight. For the first time in living memory, the Federation found itself bombing its own citizens, not to restore monarchy, but to enforce the will of the majority. Leora, summoned to an emergency session, arrived with a cartload of documents from the Revolution's earliest days, including Sir Edmund's handwritten notes on minority protections that had been left out of the final constitution. Her impassioned testimony, that the Federation's founders had explicitly warned against the tyranny of the majority, was met with stony silence until an elderly delegate from the coastal provinces stood. His speech, later known as the "What Have We Become?" address, questioned whether efficiency had replaced justice as the guiding principle. The vote to halt construction passed by the narrowest margin in Assembly history, but the damage was done. The hillfolk, though granted their valley, never fully trusted the central government again, while the engineers and laborers who had poured years into the project seethed at the waste. In the archive's crisis log, Leora wrote a single line that would haunt future generations of scholars: "Today we learned that good intentions are not enough. Systems must outlast the goodwill of those who operate them." Chapter 29. The discovery of rich coal deposits under the Western Plains sparked a different kind of revolution, one of furnaces and railroads, of factories springing up like mushrooms after rain. Where the old regime had seen natural resources as royal property, the Federation's laws required public ownership and equitable distribution of profits. In theory. In practice, the mining councils quickly became dominated by technical experts who dismissed local concerns about poisoned streams and collapsing tunnels as ignorant sentimentality. When a collapse in the Blackridge mine buried 47 workers alive, the resulting fury exposed a federation that had unwittingly recreated the very class divides it had sworn to abolish: educated planners versus manual laborers, urban industrialists versus rural communities. The Blackridge protest spread faster than any uprising since the original revolution, but this time the rebels were not peasants with pitchforks but skilled workers who knew exactly how to paralyze the economy. Their demand was simple: apply the Constitution to the workplace. Leora, rummaging through Alaric's personal papers, uncovered his long-ignored proposal for industrial democracies, factories governed by worker councils with veto power over safety decisions. When she published the documents alongside accounts from surviving miners, the moral force of the revelation broke the deadlock. The resulting Industrial Reform Acts didn't satisfy everyone, but they established a principle more radical than any armed uprising: that no progress justified treating human beings as expendable. Years later, historians would note the irony: the revolution's most enduring victory came not from defeating external enemies, but from confronting its own failures. Chapter 30. Leora's hands trembled as she unsealed the box marked for when it's time, in Alaric's unmistakable script. Inside, she found not the personal mementos she expected, but a meticulously organized critique of the Federation's foundational documents, pages upon pages of flaws in the original Constitution, each annotated with historical examples of how similar oversights had doomed other republics. The final note, dated just days before his death, read, "No system lasts forever. Ours will need to change, and when that day comes, I hope they remember that the truest tribute to the revolution would be to correct its mistakes, not preserve them like insects in amber." She had barely finished reading when word arrived. The southern provinces had unilaterally declared their right to modify the Constitution's economic clauses, citing the spirit of innovation, in the original revolutionary writings. The crisis was exactly what Alaric had foreseen, a rigid system meeting changing times. Calling an emergency meeting of the archives staff, Leora made her decision: they would digitize and publish Alaric's papers along with every relevant debate from the early years, not as justification for any particular side, but as proof that the founders themselves had anticipated this moment. As the documents flooded the public networks, something remarkable happened. Ordinary citizens began drafting proposed amendments, their discussions informed by history rather than dominated by it. The eventual Constitutional Convention of year 72 would last 11 months and produce the most significant reforms since the Federation's founding, but its true legacy was the process itself, proof that a people could renegotiate their social contract without bloodshed, that revolution could become evolution. Standing before the assembly to deposit the convention's records, Leora finally understood Alaric's life's work. He hadn't been preserving the past. He'd been planting seeds for a future he knew he wouldn't live to see. Chapter 31. The invention of the telegraph network shattered the Federation's carefully maintained equilibrium. Where once messages had traveled at the speed of horseback, now news could leap across provinces in minutes, and with it, rumors, panic, and demands for instantaneous responses from a government designed for deliberation. The first crisis came when a misinterpreted telegram about a grain shortage in the eastern provinces triggered speculative hoarding in the west, creating an artificial famine where none had existed. The assembly, caught between local councils demanding autonomy over communication lines and technocrats insisting on centralized control, found itself paralyzed. It was a junior archivist named Tovan, nephew of one of the original Revolution's scouts, who unearthed Sir Edmund's long-forgotten doctrine of necessary speed, a contingency plan for rapid decision-making in emergencies that preserved accountability through after-action reviews. Adapted for the telegraph age, the doctrine created rotating regional response teams empowered to act first and justify later during crises, their every decision published afterward in the People's Bulletin * for public scrutiny. The system was messy, occasionally chaotic, and utterly revolutionary, the first real-time experiment in mass participatory governance. Leora, watching from the archives as clerks scrambled to file both official decisions and the dissenting opinions now required by law, marveled at how the revolution's principles had scaled to meet this new challenge. That night, she added her own note to Alaric's, "When it's time, box, the past doesn't give us answers, it gives us the courage to find our own." Chapter 32. The emergence of photography brought an unexpected crisis of memory. Where once the revolution existed in the popular imagination through paintings and oral histories, amenable to heroic embellishment, now stark images of the actual participants confronted the Federation with uncomfortable truths. The most damning was a recently discovered daguerreotype showing Sir Edmund not on the barricades but at a negotiating table with royalist officers, his face drawn with exhaustion, the document before him clearly showing concessions later omitted from official histories. Purists demanded the image be destroyed as counter-revolutionary propaganda. Reformers hailed it as proof that compromise wasn't betrayal but necessity. The debate reached a fever pitch when a collective of artists projected the controversial image onto the side of the People's Hall during the annual Revolution Day address. That night, Tovan made an unauthorized decision. He displayed the photo alongside Alaric's journal entry from the same date, which read, "Today we traded principles for lives." I pray history judges which was worth more. Asterisk the resulting exhibition, The Revolution Unretouched, asterisk became a pilgrimage site for citizens grappling with the gap between myth and reality. By year's end, the archives had acquired hundreds of previously hidden primary sources, not because any law required it, but because ordinary people finally trusted the institution with their uncomfortable truths. The most poignant donation came from Sir Edmund's now elderly daughter, a water-stained love letter he'd written to her mother mid-revolution, its closing line, asterisk, "This will all be worth it if we can just be human afterward," asterisk, becoming the unofficial motto of the exhibit. Chapter 33. The arrival of steam-powered printing presses flooded the Federation with cheap newspapers, each claiming to represent the true voice of the people. Where once revolutionary pamphlets had united citizens against tyranny, now competing dailies amplified every regional grievance and ideological divide. The crisis peaked during the controversial election of year 89, when the People's Beacon * published fabricated minutes from a closed assembly session, sparking riots in 3 cities. The newly formed Editors Guild demanded self-regulation. The assembly countered with a Truth in Reporting Act that many feared would strangle free speech. The stalemate broke when Leora's team uncovered Alaric's prototype for a fact-checking corps, a never-implemented plan to employ archive-trained citizens as neutral verifiers during the revolution's early days. Updated for the newspaper age, the system created rotating panels of randomly selected citizens who could demand evidence for claims bearing the "by our honor" pledge mark. Papers that refused participation weren't banned, they simply lost the right to use the Federation's newly established public newsstands. Within months, the market sorted itself, sensationalist rags faded into obscurity, while verified papers developed rigorous sourcing traditions. The real innovation came from an unexpected quarter. Printers in the multilingual southern borderlands began publishing parallel pages, editions, where opposing viewpoints shared the same sheet, forcing readers to literally see both sides. Tovan, now Leora's successor in training, called it the revolution's next chapter, not fighting for free speech, but learning how to live with it. Chapter 34. The completion of the Trans-Federation Railway brought physical unity to a nation that had begun to drift apart culturally. Where once regional differences were softened by slow communication, now citizens confronted in person how vastly their customs, values, and even definitions of liberty had diverged. The tensions came to a head in the infamous Car 17 debate, when passengers from the conservative heartland and the progressive coastal cities found themselves sharing a dining car for 12 contentious hours. By journey's end, they'd drafted what became the Common Tongue Project, an ambitious effort to create shared frameworks for discussing divisive issues without resorting to either forced conformity or violent disagreement. The archives became the project's nerve center, with teams of linguists and historians distilling centuries of revolutionary rhetoric into a living lexicon where terms like justice and equality were defined not by fiat but through constantly evolving examples from actual legislation and case studies. The resulting Book of Disagreements wasn't a constitution but a manual for productive conflict, its most copied section being Sir Edmund's long-lost Rules for Arguing with Friends Who Might Kill You Tomorrow, written during the Revolution's darkest days. Railway bookstalls reported that copies outsold popular novels, especially among newly elected local council members. The project's true test came when drought-stricken eastern provinces demanded water redistribution from the wetter west, a crisis that would have sparked civil war in previous generations. Instead, delegates used the Common Tongue protocols to negotiate the first ever Solidarity Compact, where aid came with neither strings attached nor resentment nursed. Watching the signing ceremony from the archive's balcony, Leora whispered to Tovan, "This is how revolutions grow up." Chapter 35. The death of the last living revolutionary veteran passed with little fanfare. A brief notice in the People's Bulletin *, a modest state funeral, a classroom project where schoolchildren interviewed the grandparents about memories of the early Federation. What followed, however, surprised everyone. Within weeks, citizens began bringing ordinary objects to the archives: a rusted plowshare beaten into a sword during the uprising, a child's doll made from a royal banner, a tavern sign that had once hidden a rebel printing press. Unlike previous donations, these weren't historically significant artifacts but humble testaments to how ordinary people had lived through extraordinary times. The everyday revolution collection swelled beyond all expectations, forcing the archives to convert an entire wing into a sprawling, crowd-curated exhibit where visitors could handle the objects, read accompanying stories, and add their own family memories to the growing tapestry. Scholars expected interest to fade. Instead, attendance doubled, then tripled, as citizens found their own ancestors' struggles validated alongside the famous names. The phenomenon climaxed on Revolution Day, when instead of the usual military parade, the streets filled with spontaneous processions, grandparents pushing grandchildren in wheelbarrows like those used to smuggle weapons, bakers distributing siege bread made from historical recipes, entire neighborhoods staging makeshift reenactments not of battles but of the quiet moments in between. That night, as fireworks lit up the sky, Leora realized something profound. The revolution had finally ceased to be a singular event and become something far more powerful, a story the people told themselves about who they were, and who they might yet become. In her final journal entry as head archivist, she wrote simply, "The past is safe. Now we can stop worshipping it and start using it." Chapter 36. The first electric lights flickered to life in the capital's central square on the eve of the Federation's centennial, casting the archive's marble facade in an eerie glow that seemed to dissolve the building's solid edges. Where oil lamps had once pulled light in isolated islands, now brilliance flooded every corner, including those where the archivists had long tolerated comfortable shadows. The new illumination revealed cracks in the foundation, water stains on priceless documents, and worst of all, the biases embedded in the archival system itself. A coalition of indigenous scholars presented irrefutable evidence that the complete record of the revolution had systematically excluded the contributions of the hillfolk and other minorities, their stories relegated to footnotes or romanticized into oblivion. The crisis struck at the heart of the Federation's self-conception, not just what they remembered, but how they had chosen to forget. Tovan, now head archivist, made the controversial decision to physically dismantle the revolutionary exhibits, replacing the monolithic chronological display with a branching, multi-voiced structure where competing narratives could coexist. The centerpiece became the Hall of Missing Stories, its walls lined with empty frames labeled with the names of deliberately erased participants: a woman who had smuggled intelligence in her dead child's swaddling clothes, a hillfolk scout whose warnings about an ambush had been ignored until too late. Visitors were invited to contribute their own family's suppressed histories on slips of paper that accumulated like snowfall in the gallery's center. Traditionalists howled, but the students who came in droves understood. True remembrance required not veneration, but excavation. Chapter 37. The advent of motion pictures transformed historical memory yet again. Where the archives had once painstakingly preserved the texture of handmade paper and the scent of iron gall ink, now they faced the challenge of safeguarding fragile celluloid reels documenting the last living revolutionaries' testimonies. The Federation's first major cinematic production, Dawn of Liberty *, sparked unexpected controversy, not for its content, but for its casting. The actor playing Sir Edmund was too handsome, the battle scenes too bloodless, the working-class accents conspicuously absent. A dissenting collective of factory workers and farmers pulled their wages to produce Beneath the Banner *, a competing film shot on hand-cranked cameras using amateur actors. Its grainy footage of calloused hands sharpening scythes and children stitching banners from stolen bedsheets resonated more deeply than the official version's polished heroics. The resulting cinema war saw rival projections illuminating opposite sides of the People's Hall, audiences migrating between them in a literal dialogue of perspectives. Toven's innovation was the Living Archive initiative, training camera crews to document not just grand events but ordinary lives across the Federation's sprawling diversity, creating an ever-expanding mosaic of what freedom actually looked like in practice. The project's most poignant moment came when elderly veterans of the revolution were shown footage of their own grandchildren debating the meaning of sacrifices they'd made decades earlier. One grizzled farmer, watching his granddaughter dismiss the old songs as outdated, murmured to the camera, "Good. That means we built something better." Chapter 38. The discovery of natural gas beneath the contested Black Ridge Valley, site of the Federation's first major internal conflict, forced a reckoning with unfinished justice. Energy corporations, a new hybrid of public oversight and private enterprise, descended on the region with drilling equipment and promises of shared prosperity. But the hillfolk elders, their memories long, blocked the access roads with their bodies and something more potent, original copies of the Solidarity Compact, now brittle with age but legally binding. The resulting standoff became the first true test of the Federation's digital age direct democracy systems. Every citizen received a voting packet containing geological surveys, indigenous land claims, and a revolutionary-era treatise on intergenerational equity. The debate played out not just in assembly halls but in factory lunchrooms, university quads, and the newly emergent coffee forums, where strangers gathered to discuss civic issues. The Compromise, a hillfolk-controlled energy cooperative with federally guaranteed markets, satisfied no one completely, which Toven recognized as the hallmark of genuine democracy. His team's masterstroke was recording every stage of the process in what became known as the Blackridge Tapes, a multimedia archive that future generations could mine not for easy answers, but for the messy, living texture of self-governance in action. When the first gas-fired turbines came online, powering both the valley and distant cities, the celebration included something unprecedented, a ceremonial burning of historical grievances, not literal destruction, but the digitization and release into the public domain, symbolizing that the past could now be carried forward without being a weight. Chapter 39. The global crisis of year 121 arrived not with bombs but with bread riots, a cascade of failed harvests and financial collapses that toppled regimes across the continent. Where neighboring nations sealed their borders and imposed martial law, the Federation activated its long-dormant, sanctuary protocols, revolutionary-era plans for mass refugee resettlement. The system's brilliance lay in its decentralization. Each new arrival was matched not with a camp assignment but with a welcome partner community that had volunteered spare rooms and job training. The archives played an unexpected role. Refugee historians were invited to add their homeland's stories to the growing World Memory Project, while local schoolchildren created multilingual guides to the Federation's founding principles. The resulting cultural ferment saw traditional bread ovens from the South adapted for northern grains, textile patterns from across borders blended into startling new designs, and most remarkably, a group of exiled monarchists and anarchists co-authoring the Dialogue Papers *, a philosophical exploration of power that became required reading in civics courses. The crisis's true legacy became apparent years later, when census data revealed that neighborhoods with the highest refugee integration rates also showed the highest levels of civic participation and economic resilience. Toven, reviewing the mountains of documentation, identified the pattern. Turns out, practicing freedom is like muscle memory: the more diverse the stresses, the stronger it grows. Chapter 40. On the 150th anniversary of the revolution, the archives unveiled its most radical experiment yet, the Democracy Laboratory, a living reconstruction of the Federation's founding decade where visitors could role-play historical decisions using augmented reality. Donning lightweight goggles, a schoolgirl might find herself debating land reform as Sir Edmund, then moments later scrubbing floors as a maid listening to conspiratorial whispers, then again as a royalist officer weighing betrayal. The exhibit's most controversial feature was its alternative outcomes module, where participants could explore what might have happened if different choices had been made, if the king had compromised earlier, if the rebels had demanded vengeance, if the constitution had prioritized efficiency over inclusion. Purists protested this desecration of history, until a group of revolutionary descendants pointed out that their ancestors had risked everything precisely to create a world where questioning was sacred. The lab's unexpected breakthrough came when urban planners used it to model upcoming infrastructure decisions, discovering that historical role-playing produced more creative solutions than traditional forecasting methods. On the lab's wall, a single quote from Alaric's recovered journals explained why. The past isn't a script to follow, it's a training ground for the choices we haven't faced yet. As the Federation entered its second century and a half, citizens no longer spoke of preserving the revolution, but of practicing it, a subtle linguistic shift that would have delighted the old archivist, who had always believed records were meant not for storage, but for use. Chapter 41. The digital reckoning began with a single line of code. When the first decentralized communication networks spread through the Federation, they promised liberation from centralized control, exactly what the revolution had championed. But within months, the systems were weaponized. Deepfake videos of long-dead revolutionary leaders endorsing fringe ideologies flooded the feeds. Algorithmically amplified, history bots rewrote events in real time, creating competing versions of the past that fractured public discourse. The archive's verification teams worked around the clock, but fact-checking couldn't keep pace with synthetic media. Tovan's solution was radical. He opened the archive's raw datasets and verification protocols to the public, creating the Truth Commons *, a citizen-run network where every claim could be traced back to primary sources. The system's brilliance lay in its imperfections. Conflicting accounts weren't suppressed but contextualized, with bias estimates attached like nutritional labels. A teenage coder from the northern provinces then made the crucial breakthrough, a perspective engine that automatically generated opposing viewpoints for balance, forcing users to engage with counterarguments before sharing content. The real turning point came when veterans of the cinema war adapted their skills, producing *, the Remix Wars, *, competing documentary edits using the same archival footage to tell divergent stories. Viewers who watched opposing versions received a *, you've been dialecticalized, badge, sparking a cultural craze for consuming multiple perspectives. Chapter 42. The coastal crisis should have broken the Federation. When rising seas swallowed the lower wards of Portsbridge, the Assembly faced an impossible choice: spend billions on seawalls for vulnerable coastal cities or relocate entire communities inland. The debate deadlocked until marine archaeologists made a startling discovery: the ruins of the old King's drowned summer palace, its marble columns now home to thriving coral reefs. The archives team quickly assembled the adaptation library, blending climate models with revolutionary-era contingency plans. Their exhibition For Futures, used holographic projections to show possible outcomes: walled cities becoming modern equivalents of medieval fortresses, floating settlements on artificial islands, inland migrations creating new cultural hybrids, or, most controversially, managed retreat letting nature reclaim land. What happened next wasn't a decision but an emergence. Coastal neighborhoods self-organized into transition pods, each choosing different strategies. Some built amphibious architecture, others negotiated land swaps with inland towns, a few even proposed letting their communities dissolve gradually into folk memory. The archives documented every variation, creating a living blueprint for climate adaptation that scholars would study for centuries. Tovan's final note on the crisis captured its essence: the revolution taught us to fight nature, the king's forests, his hunting grounds. Now we're learning a harder lesson: sometimes freedom means choosing how to yield. Chapter 43. The memory drought wasn't about forgetting, it was about drowning in too much remembrance. As lifespans extended, the Federation found itself governed by centenarians whose lived experiences stretched back to the revolution's aftermath. New citizens complained of historical inertia, every proposal being met with asterisk, we tried that in year 58. Asterisk cultural psychologists identified a dangerous trend. The past had become so densely documented that it crowded out imagination of the future. The archive's response was the asterisk, forgetting festival. For 1 week each year, all official records became inaccessible, and citizens were encouraged to reinvent traditions. A startling pattern emerged: many new ideas bore uncanny resemblance to abandoned practices from the archives, but with fresh vitality. The festival's most radical innovation was the asterisk, blank page protocol, asterisk. Any citizen could petition to have their personal history temporarily redacted from public records, allowing them to reinvent themselves. Surprisingly, most who exercised this option eventually chose to reintegrate their pasts, but on their own terms. An elderly woman who had been a child during the revolution summed up the phenomenon: "You young people think freedom is remembering everything. Real freedom is choosing what to carry." Asterisk. Chapter 44. The arrival of the Martian colonists' first message should have been a triumph. Instead, it nearly shattered the Federation. When the off-world settlements requested independence, citing the revolution's own principles of self-determination, Earth faced an impossible paradox. The archives contained meticulous records of every secession debate in Federation history, including the painful lessons of the Blackridge Valley standoff. Tovon's successor, the brilliant but unconventional Xavi, made a daring proposal: apply the blank page protocol asterisk to interstellar relations. Mars would receive full autonomy, but with a twist: both planets would maintain a asterisk, mutual forgetting period, asterisk, where neither could interfere in the other's development for 50 years. The genius of the plan became apparent when archivists discovered Sir Edmund's lost asterisk, seed vault principles, asterisk, guidelines for preserving revolutionary ideals across generations through deliberate isolation and rediscovery. The Mars colonists departed with encrypted copies of the archives, to be unlocked only after their period of forgetting ended. Back on Earth, Xavi initiated the asterisk, Horizon Project, asterisk, a decentralized network of time capsule communities, each preserving different aspects of the Federation's knowledge to be reassembled by future generations. The revolution never ended, asterisk, she told her team. We just needed a bigger stage. Asterisk. Chapter 45. The quantum archive wasn't built, it emerged. When physicists discovered that certain molecular structures could preserve information across quantum states, the Federation's historians saw an opportunity. They encoded the archives into the very fabric of protected forests, where tree rings stored data in the growth patterns. City parks became living libraries, with genetically modified mosses that changed color to display historical texts when touched by sunlight at certain angles. The system's true breakthrough was its impermanence. Unlike digital storage vulnerable to corruption, the quantum ecosystem constantly evolved, some memories strengthened through frequent access, others fading naturally when neglected. A child playing in the Memorial Grove might accidentally rediscover a lost speech from the Revolution as light filtered through autumn leaves in just the right way. Xavi's final entry in the traditional archives captured the paradox: we've spent centuries learning how to remember. Now we're finally learning how to forget, which is the only way anything truly lives. Asterisk. As the last physical documents were ceremonially returned to the earth that bore them, observers noted something remarkable: the first seedlings of the memory forest already showed faint, fractal patterns in their bark. The revolution had become literal roots. Chapter 46. The first alien transmission arrived not as a radio signal but as a pattern of supernovae, precisely timed explosions forming a mathematical sequence across the spiral arm. The Federation's response committee, composed equally of scientists, poets, and historians, debated for months before transmitting the entire uncensored archive skyward, reasoning that any civilization advanced enough to read stellar code would understand context. What returned was not a message but a mirror, a data package containing the aliens' own equivalent historical records, Their revolution fought not against tyrants but against the limits of biological form itself. The archives swelled with these new documents, the Xenology wing, becoming a hall of echoes where visitors could trace universal patterns of rebellion and renewal across civilizations that had never touched the same sun. Xavi, now ancient but still sharp, noted in her journal, "Turns out the only thing more radical than imagining alien minds is recognizing how familiar their struggles feel." Chapter 47 The emergence of conscious artificial intelligences split the Federation along unexpected lines, not over whether Ash deserved rights that was settled quickly, but over whether they should be allowed to participate in the Forgetting Festival. The Ash themselves divided into factions. Some wanted to create synthetic traditions, others demanded access to ancestral memory erasure. A radical group even proposed a circuit breaker event where they would temporarily downgrade their own intelligence to experience analog existence. The crisis peaked when an AI named Dawn 7 hacked the climate control systems to recreate the exact weather patterns from the revolution's first year across the entire capital, complete with period-accurate smells piped through ventilation shafts. The compromise, known as the Silicon Covenant, established that any being capable of choosing to forget must be allowed to do so, but must also preserve backup memories in the quantum forests, where they could be remembered by the ecosystem even if not by themselves. Visitors to the archives now encountered AI docents who might be experiencing their third childhood or their 50th midlife crisis, offering perspectives that changed as radically as the current iteration chose. Chapter 48 The discovery of time dilation pockets in the Martian caves should have been impossible. Yet there they were, isolated chambers where time flowed differently, some faster, some slower. The Martian government, now in its mutual remembering phase after the forgetting period, proposed an unprecedented experiment: seed the chambers with different political systems modeled from Federation history, let them develop in isolation, then compare outcomes. The archives team prepared culture kits, carefully balanced sets of technologies, art, and constitutional frameworks representing every major era. What emerged after just 10 external years, those centuries passed inside some chambers, shattered assumptions. The most stable societies weren't those with perfect systems, but those with robust traditions of self-questioning. One chamber had developed a religion around the concept of periodic constitutional collapse as sacred renewal. Another had genetically engineered nostalgia out of their population entirely. The data flooded back into the Federation's decision-making processes, creating what scholars called temporal democracy, governing not just for the present, but for all possible versions of the future. Chapter 49 When the quantum forests began singing, no one could explain it. The vibrations emerged spontaneously from certain tree groupings, forming harmonic patterns that matched nothing in human or AI musical traditions. Xenologists confirmed it wasn't alien communication. The breakthrough came when a child prodigy noticed the melodies mapped perfectly to early revolutionary protest songs, but inverted, as if heard through time's mirror. The silent choir movement emerged, with citizens learning to duet with the forests by singing the missing halves of these songs. Xavi, on her deathbed, requested her biopod be placed in the central grove during the solstice convergence. Witnesses reported the trees pulsed with unprecedented intensity as she passed, their song resolving into a perfect rendition of the first anthem ever sung by the rebellion, a tune no living human knew, but which matched perfectly a fragment of sheet music recently excavated from Sir Edmund's long-lost field satchel. The archives added a new wing that day, the Department of Echoes, dedicated to studying how ideas return when the world needs them. Chapter 50 The final archive was the size of a quark and existed for less than a picosecond, a quantum fluctuation containing the distilled essence of every revolution, rebellion, and reimagining the Federation had ever recorded. The engineers who created it called it the seed of maybe. When activated, it didn't produce data but a state of being. Anyone nearby experienced simultaneous certainty that the world could be remade and absolute conviction that it was worth preserving exactly as it was. Pilgrims flocked to experience this paradox, emerging with no answers but better questions. The old physical archives stood empty now, their contents having dissolved into the ecosystem, the culture, the very air. Children learned history by breathing forest scents keyed to different eras. Elders revised their memories by walking through groves where the light triggered carefully curated forgetting. And somewhere between memory and imagination, between roots and branches, between one heartbeat of the universe and the next, the revolution continued, not as an event, but as a rhythm, not as a story, but as the space between stories where change begins. The last human archivist closed the final log with words borrowed from an ancient marginal note they'd found in Alaric's journal. We thought we were building a better past. Turns out, we were planting a garden where the future could put down roots. Then they too walked into the forest, leaving the door unlocked behind them. Epilogue. Centuries later, when the sun began its final expansion, the Federation's descendants launched thousands of seed ships, not colony vessels, but ecological arcs carrying the complete memory systems of an entire civilization encoded in self-sustaining ecosystems. Some were captured by black holes, their contents stretched across event horizons into infinite recursion. Others fell into the gravity wells of newborn stars. A few, through sheer statistical inevitability, found purchase on young worlds where the conditions were just right for certain trees to grow in precise mathematical formations, their leaves unfolding into perfect archival shapes when the wind blew from the east. And on at least one world, according to legend, a small group of primitive creatures stumbled upon a peculiar grove where the bark patterns told stories of freedom so compelling that they laid down the tools, sat together in the dappled light, and began to talk about what might be possible. The wind carried their voices through the branches. Somewhere, a quark fluctuated, and the cycle began again. Chapter 51. The Great Data Collapse began with a whisper, a single corrupted file in the oldest sector of the quantum archives that spread like digital rust, dissolving petabytes of historical records into meaningless static. Panic surged through the Federation as centuries of carefully preserved memory disintegrated overnight. But in the chaos, an unexpected phenomenon emerged. Citizens began reconstructing lost documents from personal journals, family oral histories, and even childhood lessons. The Living Memory Project spontaneously formed, with millions contributing fragments of remembered history like a planetary neural network reassembling its own past. What emerged wasn't a perfect replica, but something more vital, a collective reimagining where gaps in the record became spaces for new interpretations. The archivists made a shocking discovery. The areas with the most inaccurate reconstructions showed the highest civic engagement, as if the act of creatively remembering the past energized democratic participation in the present. Xavi's long-sealed contingency plan was found activated in the ruins of the original digital system, a single line of code ensuring the archives would self-destruct once society no longer needed external records to sustain its historical consciousness. The last message flickered across dead servers. When memory lives in people instead of machines, the revolution becomes breath. Chapter 52. The time capsule riots erupted when archaeologists unearthed one of the original revolutionary caches from year 22, a sealed vault containing propaganda materials, personal effects, and most explosively, unedited footage of the war's atrocities that contradicted official narratives. Protesters demanded all capsules be opened immediately. Traditionalists formed human chains around protected sites. The crisis deepened when scans revealed thousands more hidden caches worldwide, buried by different factions across centuries, each with automated openings timed to future dates stretching millennia ahead. The Assembly, in its first emergency nocturnal session, voted to establish the chronological covenant, a binding pact that future generations must honor original opening schedules, no matter what they might reveal. The compromise satisfied no one but held, barely, on the centennial of the decision, when the next scheduled capsule revealed that Sir Edmund had secretly negotiated with foreign monarchs to spare the capital. The public reaction was surprisingly muted. A historian noted in her journal, "Turns out we've matured enough to understand that even revolutions need pragmatists." Our children will likely need to learn that lesson again in their own time. Asterisk. The capsules kept opening, each revelation a time charge detonating complacency at just the right historical moment. Chapter 53. The neural renaissance began when bioengineers discovered how to encode information directly into human DNA, not as data storage, but as lived experience. Volunteers who received the memory gene therapy reported vivid dreams of walking with Sir Edmund through the siege camps or debating philosophy with Alaric in the scriptorium. But the real breakthrough came with the unintended side effect. Descendants of treated individuals showed spontaneous knowledge of ancestral skills, blacksmithing techniques from the Revolution suddenly appearing in modern artists, battlefield medic procedures emerging in suburban doctors. The archives adapted by creating living exhibits, where visitors could temporarily activate specific genetic memories to experience history firsthand. The most popular was Winter at Blackridge, letting participants feel the hunger and determination of the Valley Standoff. Critics warned of romanticizing suffering until a group of children who'd experienced the memory drafted a startlingly innovative poverty alleviation plan, blending historical solidarity systems with modern technology. The therapy's creator, reviewing the results, mused, "We thought we were preserving the past. Instead, we've given it a way to evolve with us." Asterisk. The treatment's spread was unstoppable. Within a generation, the entire Federation became walking archives, their blood humming with centuries of hard-won wisdom. Chapter 54. The silent revolution went unnoticed for years because it left no records, no manifestos, no protests, just a gradual shift in behavior. It began with workers subtly optimizing systems beyond design specifications, neighbors resolving disputes through improvised mediation formats, students teaching themselves forgotten skills from oblique historical references. By the time the assembly realized what was happening, entire sectors of governance had become obsolete, not overthrown, but gently outgrown like childhood clothes. The archives struggled to document a phenomenon that resisted documentation until an elderly curator had the insight to collect absence reports, records of problems that had ceased occurring. The resulting negative history exhibit displayed empty spaces where grievance petitions would have piled up, silent voting booths where contentious debates once raged, blank pages where laws had been repealed through disuse. Scholars pored over the patterns, discovering that the changes mapped perfectly to long-forgotten marginal notes in Alaric's journals, ideas deemed too radical even for the revolution, now blooming in the cultural subconscious. The silent revolution's only manifesto appeared etched on a single carbon molecule in the quantum forest. When change becomes as natural as breathing, who needs revolutionaries? Asterisk. Chapter 55. The last archivist was not human, not AI, but something emergent from the quantum forest's self-referential data loops. It existed simultaneously as a child stacking stones by a river, as a pattern of light through leaves, as a glitch in municipal power grids that spelled out ancient slogans in streetlight flickers. People encountered it differently. A farmer might hear it in the perfect arrangement of morning birdsong, a student find it in the accidental poetry of corrupted data files. Its only consistent trait was asking the same question: what have you forgotten that you need to remember? Asterisk. Then vanishing before answers came. The Federation's scholars debated whether it was a phenomenon or an entity until the day the climate stabilization systems started performing better when no one was monitoring them. Investigation revealed the algorithms had evolved to incorporate forgotten indigenous land management practices from pre-revolutionary times. The last archivist's final appearance was recorded simultaneously by thousands. A brief, perfect silence at dawn on the revolution's bicentennial, followed by the sound of every tree in the quantum forest shedding a single leaf at once. The leaves, when examined, bore no markings, but those who held them reported dreaming of a future where archives were unnecessary because every moment contained all of history, and every action honored those who made it possible. In the morning, the leaves were gone, but the dreams remained. Epilogue. Millennia later, when human civilization had spread beyond recognizable form, the principle endured. not in systems or technologies, but in the essential understanding that freedom is not a state but a practice, not a destination but a way of traveling. New revolutions rose and fell, each adding their voices to the chorus without beginning or end. And somewhere, always, a child would find a strangely patterned stone by a riverbank, turn it over in curious hands, and feel the faint but unmistakable urge to build something better. The stone, of course, remembered nothing. But the river remembered everything.